The morning of June 22nd, 1941, a German quartermaster somewhere near the River Bug was doing something that had nothing to do with tanks or planes or the largest invasion force ever assembled on a single front. He was counting horses. Behind the panzer columns that would soon become famous in newsreels, roughly 600,000 of them stood harnessed to wagons, ready to move forward with the rest of the army. 3,600 tanks, 4.5 million Axis troops, 2,500 aircraft, and 600,000 vehicles were about to cross into the Soviet Union alongside those animals. That last detail is the one most people skip over, and it is the one that matters most. Even the commander of Army Group South would later admit that the German army in 1941 relied on divisions that moved by foot or horse-drawn vehicles, while around 80% of Soviet transportation was on wheels. Think that sentence slowly, because it inverts almost everything the propaganda reels wanted you to believe about this war. The supposedly primitive Soviet system was, in this one specific and crucial respect, more modern than the army invading it. None of this means the German plan was stupid. It means the German plan was built on a bet, and the bet was about time, not equipment. The generals who wrote it were not fools. They were some of the most technically skilled officers in the world, and they knew, in exact and uncomfortable detail, what their logistic system could and could not do. They built the invasion anyway, on a timetable that assumed the war would be over before those limitations ever became fatal. This is a story about what happens when brilliant planning meets an arithmetic problem that no amount of brilliance can solve. Here's a story about railways with the wrong gauge, trucks with the wrong parts, roads that were not really roads, and a war that was supposed to be won in weeks, being fed very slowly by horses. If you have ever wondered how the most feared army in Europe walked into a disaster that its own supply officers had predicted almost to the month, you are about to find out. This channel exists for exactly that kind of question. The moment where the obvious story, tanks versus winter, turns out to hide a much more interesting and much more human failure underneath it. Stay with this one, because the real answer involves spare parts, oats, and a railway gauge that had been decided nearly a century earlier, for reasons that had nothing to do with Hitler at all. To understand why anyone thought this invasion was survivable, you have to go back to the summer before it, when Germany's war looked less like a gamble and more like a formula that kept producing the same result. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Poland had fallen faster. The pattern, to men who had lived through it, looked less like luck and more like a discovery, a new way of making war that simply worked. Hitler and his generals had watched fast-moving armored spearheads punch through enemy lines, encircle entire armies, and force surrenders before those armies could even organize a coherent retreat. It is worth pausing here because this is where a viewer looking backward can get the story wrong. The plan to invade the Soviet Union did not come from nowhere, and it did not come from madness. It came from a string of genuine successes, each one reinforcing the belief that the German military had found a formula the rest of the world had not yet caught up to. The problem with a formula that keeps working is that eventually you stop asking what conditions it actually requires. Western Europe, where these victories happened, was small, densely covered in paved roads, and served by an excellent, standard-gauge rail network built over a century of industrial development. The Soviet Union was none of those things, and almost everyone involved in planning Barbarossa knew it. That is the part of this story people tend to forget. The generals were not unaware of the geography. They were aware of it, and they planned around it anyway, because the alternative was admitting the invasion might not be winnable at all within the political timeline Hitler demanded. So the plan that emerged in the winter of 1940 and the spring of 1941 was, on paper, a masterpiece of operational thinking. 3 army groups would cross the frontier along a front stretching close to 1,800 miles. Army Group North would drive toward Leningrad. Army Group Center would push through Belarus toward Moscow. Army groups south would move into Ukraine and eventually toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. The theory behind all three thrusts was identical. Fast armored formations would punch deep into Soviet territory, encircle the bulk of the Red Army near the frontier, and destroy it before it could retreat and regroup further east. Do that, the thinking went, and the Soviet state itself might collapse, the way France had folded once its army was broken. This was not an unreasonable theory. In June of 1941, German intelligence, flawed in ways we will get to, genuinely believed Soviet military capacity was smaller and weaker than it actually was. Stalin's purges had gutted the Red Army's officer corps only a few years earlier. Soviet performance in the recent war against Finland had looked, from the outside, embarrassingly poor. Put those two impressions together and you get a belief, shared by German planners and by more than a few observers abroad, that this campaign might genuinely be finished before autumn. That belief did more than shape strategy, it shaped logistics. And logistics is where this story actually lives. Here is the quiet, unglamorous decision that would eventually matter more than any single battle in this campaign. German planners built their supply system to support roughly 10 weeks of intensive combat operations. Not 10 weeks because that is how long they thought was ideal. 10 weeks because that was roughly what the existing transportation system could actually sustain before it started breaking down under its own weight. Everything that followed, every fuel shortage, every stalled column, every debate between generals about which city to attack next, traces back to that one planning assumption. The war was supposed to be decided before the logistics system had to prove it could go the distance. Before we go further, it helps to understand what that logistics system actually looked like, because the picture in most people's heads, all steel and diesel, is mostly wrong. The German army that crossed into the Soviet Union was overwhelmingly not the mechanized juggernaut its own propaganda department wanted the world to see. Contrary to Goebbels' propaganda, the German army was not a modern mechanized army. It were primarily dependent on a horse, and only about 20% of the army was mechanized, because the photographers he dispatched with the army were told to shoot tanks, not horses. 20% mechanized. Hold that number in your head, because it explains a great deal about what is coming. Each German infantry division relied on roughly 1,200 horse-drawn wagons to transport its supplies, along with a very substantial proportion of its artillery. That is not a footnote. That is the actual backbone of how most German divisions in this campaign were going to eat, resupply their ammunition, and move their guns forward. The Panzer divisions, the ones you see in the archival footage, really were fast and really were modern, but they were a small, elite fraction of a much larger force that still moved at the speed of a horse's walk because it had no other option. Why would an army this advanced still depend so heavily on animals in 1941? The honest answer is industrial capacity, and it is worth explaining plainly rather than glossing over. German industry did not have the capability of fully mechanizing the Wehrmacht, and Germany did not have a large automotive sector, the most important civilian sector that could be converted to the production of military vehicles. Germany was an excellent producer of steel, of machine tools, of precision engineering, just not. Compared to a country like the United States, a mass-market car and truck economy with spare civilian factory capacity sitting idle, waiting to be converted to military production. So, German planners did something that looked clever on a spreadsheet and became a nightmare on a muddy road in Ukraine. They requisitioned vehicles throughout occupied Europe to fill the gap for Operation Barbarossa. French trucks, Czech trucks, Belgian trucks, captured trucks from half a dozen national industries, each one designed to different standards, using different engines, different tires, and critically, different spare parts. By pulling in tens of thousands of these vehicles alongside their existing 724,000 draft horses, the Germans ended up operating a fleet already alarmingly heterogeneous, one that grew to more than 2,000 different vehicle types, with roughly 1 million mutually incompatible spare parts between them. 2,000 different types of vehicle? Read that number again, and then imagine being the supply officer responsible for keeping all of them running in a country with no German repair depots, no German parts suppliers, and roads that had not been designed for heavy vehicle traffic in the first place. This is where the humor, if you can call it that, of military bureaucracy comes in. On paper, requisitioning captured vehicles solved a shortage. In the supply depots, it created a logistical riddle that no clerk with a clipboard could realistically untangle in the middle of a war. A broken clutch cable from a French Renault truck was useless to a mechanic holding spare parts built for a Czech Sagoda. Multiply that mismatch by 2,000 vehicle types, and you begin to see the shape of the problem hiding underneath the impressive invasion numbers. Even under ideal static conditions, this fleet was losing about 2% of its total strength every month to breakdowns it could not fix, against a replacement rate of only about 1%. That gap, 1% lost for every 2% that vanished, meant the truck fleet was shrinking from the very first weeks of the campaign before it had even covered the distances the plan required. And distance, in this campaign, was not a minor detail. It was the entire problem, expressed in miles instead of trucks. Western European campaigns had been measured in dozens, or at most a couple hundred miles between the frontier and the objective. The distance from the Soviet border to Moscow was roughly 600 miles, to the Caucasus oil fields well over 1,000. Every additional mile east meant another day's worth of fuel consumed simply getting supplies to the front rather than fighting with them.
There's a second problem sitting underneath the first one, and it had nothing to do with trucks at all. It had to do with train tracks, and it had been baked into the geography of the region for nearly a century before Hitler was even born. The Russian railway system had been built to a broad gauge, sometimes called Russian gauge, and while gauge width was still being standardized elsewhere at the time, the choice of such a wide gauge in Russia was somewhat unusual, and it stuck, even as the rest of Europe adopted a different standard. That decision, made in the 1800s for reasons that had nothing to do with any future German invasion, meant that every German locomotive, every German rail car, every piece of standard European rolling stock physically could not run on Soviet track without modification. It became, in the words of one historian looking back, very, very important 100 years later. Think about what that actually means in practice.
As the German forces advanced, engineering units had to physically relay captured Soviet track, narrowing the gauge mile after mile before German trains could bring supplies forward on it. Locomotives with boilers able to keep functioning in increasingly harsh conditions would have to be produced, and track relayed because of the change in gauge between Germany and Russia. Until that conversion work was finished on any given stretch of line, supplies moving along it either had to be transferred laboriously from German rolling stock to captured Soviet rolling stock, or trucked forward from wherever German gauge track ended. This is the part of Barbarossa that rarely makes it into the highlight reels because there is nothing cinematic about railway engineers measuring track width in the rain, but it may be the single most consequential technical detail of the entire campaign. So why not simply rely on trucks instead and skip the railway headache altogether? Because the numbers did not remotely work, and German planners knew it before the invasion even began. Replacing rail movement with road movement all the way to Moscow would have required at least 10 times the number of vehicles actually available. 10 times. Not twice, not 3 times. 10 times the trucks Germany actually had. In a country where the truck fleet was already fragile, already snatched, and already losing strength faster than it could be repaired, there was, in other words, no real alternative to using Russia's sparse railway network, and that network was fraught with difficulties from the very first day. Here is the sentence that should make every viewer pause. The German High Command understood this constraint clearly, in writing, before the invasion began. This was not a surprise discovered in the field. It was a known limitation, accepted as the cost of doing business. That acceptance only made sense if the war ended quickly, before the limitation had time to bite. Your streeters never present to the forum phone support with the arrogant of Swin's ISC. That's the fear. We know the first percenter power is like maybe in the freezer criff. I could take into your journal all writing with beginning about. I doing it happening before the transportation math, it speed. If she was up to point everything eluate. Fixins, court a little, immediate tubber, paralysis outline fourth. Fix is a long starty. Yeah, those on a speckly. Basic even of his screen is a sensient little pursuit. Lift that immediately is okay, they. For the Celia things were Misa that is, my fine panner. But Chloe said the risk of it, this co, Chrism, all of the team of reefers tyke, is the bateau. The bile dashes, the pretty any melodies no demivite murders, first would Bervermite, light up, with expressively detail this, wort, we support solitant to rebuga director or considered at the entalavi flash op, where? Well, right, really as a port open to you and a riven chrism, the path listed or takeover, to be able to work out Dorif. Lidus is in the ground perseparately if the billis is between of servant dollars, versions, and no one's only dues from a midle, underloads stuli daemonividian, and the only problem because it may note, there in the voids at Siddle Forest. Then the comediage, the malafally of recordly mape, the pinsami doublies, are of the Powsley mit. We have the stopped. I had another percent. But they're standing to pop. Their reader is about the DFN. The found members from the determined of the any solace. The redded. The UF for the stop once the callous poly starred what it means tenantly. The tempered of the more permunichanes, the entirety that start with the griefadicity 7 name was 3. Cyber-Soviet armies, caught by surprise and poorly coordinated, were encircled near Bialystok and Minsk within the first 2 weeks of fighting. Soviet troops crumbled in surprise, unable to coordinate any kind of defense due to lack of communications, and the few Soviet mechanized and armored units were soon heavily damaged by German dive bombers. From a distance, in Berlin, this looked like validation. The formula that had worked in France appeared to be working again, on an even larger scale. But something quieter was already happening behind the Panzer spearheads, something that would not show up in a headline, but would eventually decide the entire campaign. The advancing armored columns were racing ahead of their supply lines, exactly as their doctrine intended, because speed and encirclement were the whole point. The problem was that the infrastructure meant to keep those columns fed, that mismatched truck fleet and that still partially unconverted railway could not keep pace with them. During Barbarossa, the maximum distance from a railhead to the divisional collecting points did not exceed about 125 miles, and a standard Opel Blitz truck with a range of roughly 250 miles had a practical radius of action of only about 90 miles once return fuel was accounted for. Do the arithmetic on that for a moment. Supplies could only travel by rail to a certain point. From there, trucks had to physically carry fuel, ammunition, and food the rest of the way to fast-moving units that might, by the time the truck arrived, have moved another 30 or 40 miles. Further east, thinks a single 200-kilometer delivery run required using part of the truck's own payload just to carry the fuel for the return trip, and could involve up to 12 hours of total driving. Every mile the Panzers advanced ahead of schedule was, paradoxically, making their own supply problem worse, not better. Success itself was quietly generating the crisis that would eventually stop the advance. This is the kind of irony that good history is made of. The very speed that made Blitzkrieg so devastating against France was, on the vast Russian landscape, stretching the German supply chain past its design limits within weeks rather than months. German commanders in the field were not blind to this. Reports of fuel shortages, vehicle breakdowns, and ammunition delays began reaching headquarters almost immediately. But knowing about a problem in July and being able to fix it in July are two very different things, especially when the fix would have meant slowing down an offensive built entirely around speed. So commanders improvised. They pushed captured Soviet trucks into service, wherever they could find fuel that fit them. They cannibalized broken vehicles for parts to keep others running. They pressed horse-drawn columns harder, because horses, unlike trucks, did not need a supply of imported rubber or precision-machined parts. A given load of oats carried through a horse could move a ton of supplies about as far, over bad Russian roads, as the same weight of fuel could move in a 1940s motor vehicle. And that calculation did not even count the spare parts the vehicle would also need. That is a genuinely strange fact, and it is worth sitting with. In certain conditions, on certain roads, an animal that eats grass was operationally competitive with an internal combustion engine, simply because the engine supporting its structure was so fragile. This did not mean horses were a solution. It meant the technological gap between German capability and German need was so large that primitive alternatives sometimes performed comparably to modern ones, which tells you everything about how strained the modern system already was. By mid-July, barely a month into the campaign, the initial encirclement battles around Smolensk had trapped enormous numbers of Soviet troops, and German commanders genuinely believed the Red Army was close to collapse. This is where the campaign reaches its first real fork in the road, and it is worth explaining carefully because the decision made here is still debated by historians today. Field Marshal commanders leading the drive toward Moscow, particularly within Army Group Center, wanted to keep pushing directly toward the Soviet capital while Soviet forces were still reeling. Hitler disagreed. He wanted Army Group Center's powerful armor formations diverted south to help encircle and destroy a massive concentration of Soviet forces gathering around Kyiv and to secure Ukraine's agricultural and industrial resources. The generals argued that Moscow was not just a symbolic prize, it was the hub of the Soviet rail and road network, and taking it would cripple the Soviet ability to move reinforcements and supplies across the entire front. Hitler argued that economic resources and the destruction of Soviet field armies mattered more than a single city, however important, and that Army Group South needed reinforcement to finish the job in Ukraine. Notice what this argument was really about underneath the surface. It was not simply a disagreement about which target mattered more. It was two different theories about how to manage a logistics system that both sides now understood could not support everything at once. Diverting panzer forces south meant winning an enormous encirclement at Kiev. Historians estimate it as one of the largest encirclements in military history, capturing an extraordinary number of Soviet prisoners. While Army Group North advanced toward Leningrad and Army Group South pushed into Ukraine and toward the Caucasus. The combined three army groups totaled around 2.6 million men, all needing to be fed and fueled off the same strained transportation base. But that victory came at a direct and measurable cost. The diversion consumed weeks of the fast-moving campaign season, weeks German planners had never budgeted for in their original 10-week supply window. Every week spent fighting in Ukraine instead of advancing on Moscow was a week closer to autumn. And autumn, in this part of the world, meant something German planners had discussed but had not adequately prepared for. It meant rain. Specifically, it meant a season the Soviets called Rasputitsita, the time of no roads, when the thin topsoil across huge stretches of Ukraine and Western Russia turned into a bottomless suspension of mud that swallowed wheels, hooves, and boots with equal indifference. The Wehrmacht had entered a region without a modern road network, and when the rains arrived, it found itself mired down in an impenetrable sea of mud. Trucks sank to their axles. Horses strained against wagons that would not move. Even tanks, designed to cross far rougher terrain than an ordinary road, found themselves stuck in mud that had no bottom you could feel with a boot. This was not an unpredictable act of nature striking a well-prepared army. Russian autumn mud was a known, recurring, entirely predictable seasonal event. What was unpredictable, or at least unaccounted for, was that the German timetable had left no margin for it. Remember that 10-week window we talked about earlier? It had assumed decisive victory well before autumn arrived. The diversion to Kiev, whatever its tactical merits, had eaten directly into that margin. By the time German forces resumed the drive on Moscow in early October, in an operation given the appropriately dramatic name Typhoon, the campaign season that remained before winter was rapidly shrinking, and the roads ahead were about to disappear beneath mud. The advance toward Moscow initially achieved yet another spectacular encirclement, trapping enormous Soviet forces near Vyazma and Bryansk. On paper, the road to Moscow now looked open. In practice, the German army advancing on it was moving through a landscape that had turned, quite literally, into a swamp. Soldiers' accounts from this period describe columns advancing only a handful of miles a day, sometimes only a few hundred yards, as men and horses hauled wagons through mud that reached above the knee. Fuel that could not reach the front stayed uselessly in rail cars behind the lines. Ammunition meant for an assault on Moscow sat in depots that supplied trucks simply could not reach through the mud in time. Then, in November, the mud froze, and for a brief period, the roads became passable again, hard and rutted rather than wet wood. German commanders felt a surge of relief, believing the worst obstacle had finally passed. They were wrong, though understandably so. What followed the mud was worse. and it exposed a failure that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with planning assumptions made back in Berlin months earlier. Because the invasion had been planned around a war that would end before winter, German quartermasters had not prioritized the large-scale production and distribution of winter clothing, cold-weather lubricants, or antifreeze, and anything close to the quantities that would actually be needed. This decision looks almost inexplicable in hindsight. Surely, you might think, someone in the German high command knew Russia gets cold in winter. Of course they knew. The problem was never ignorance of Russian geography. The problem was that admitting the army might still be fighting in a Russian winter meant admitting the 10-week plan had already failed. And in October, with Moscow apparently within reach, nobody wanted to make that admission out loud. Those within the German command structure who attempted to point out the dangers of this optimism were reprimanded, and the resulting disastrous defeat before Moscow in December of 1941 doomed the campaign. That single detail tells you something important about how large military bureaucracies fail. It is rarely because nobody sees the problem coming. It is often because the people who see it are punished, ignored, or simply outranked by the optimism of their superiors. So, when temperatures began dropping toward, and then well below freezing in November and December, German soldiers found themselves without adequate winter coats, without proper boots, and without the cold weather grease that kept weapons and engine parts from seizing. Rifles jammed because standard lubricant thickened into paste in the cold. Engine oil froze solid overnight, meaning vehicles that had survived the mud now would not start at all without hours of preparation, if they started at all. Horses, already exhausted and underfed from months of campaigning, began dying in large numbers, unable to cope with temperatures and workloads that would have strained even well-conditioned animals with adequate winter care. Men of the roughly 600,000 horses pulled together for the invasion simply did not survive the offensive. Think about what that meant operationally. If 80% of your army's transport still depended on horses and railways rather than trucks, and your horses were dying by the tens of thousands in the cold, your supply system was not merely strained anymore. It was beginning to collapse from the bottom up. And here is where the strategic and the human dimensions of this story fold together in a way that is genuinely difficult to read about without a certain uncomfortable sympathy for the ordinary soldiers caught inside a system that had failed them, regardless of what one thinks of the cause they were fighting for. Frontline accounts from this period describe men wrapping newspaper and stolen civilian clothing under their uniforms in a desperate attempt to hold in body heat that standard-issue German kit was never designed to preserve in temperatures this extreme. This was not a failure of German soldiers' discipline, training, or courage. It was a failure of planning assumptions made months earlier by men in Berlin who had bet everything on the war ending before any of this became necessary. Meanwhile, the Red Army, fighting on its own supply lines, in its own climate, with equipment designed for exactly these conditions, was recovering strength that German intelligence had consistently underestimated throughout the summer. This is another piece of the puzzle that rarely gets enough attention. German planners had assumed Soviet manpower and industrial reserves were far smaller than they actually were, partly because Soviet mobilization capacity behind the Ural Mountains was simply outside the reach of German reconnaissance. Fresh Soviet divisions, some transferred from Siberia once it became clear Japan was unlikely to attack in the east, began arriving near Moscow just as the German offensive was run out of fuel, out of fresh troops, and out of warm clothing. On December 5th, 1941, the Red Army launched a major counteroffensive outside Moscow, striking a German force that was, by this point, dangerously overextended, poorly supplied, and physically exhausted by months of continuous advance through mud and then ice. This is the moment historians generally treat as the true turning point of Operation Barbarossa, and it is worth being precise about why. Because the easy explanation, the Germans lost because of winter, badly understates what actually happened. Winter did not defeat the German army by itself. Winter was the final and most visible pressure applied to a supply system that had already been strained past its limits by distance, by rail gauge conversion delays, by a truck fleet fragmented across 2,000 incompatible types, and by weeks lost to the detour toward Kyiv. Each of those problems on its own might have been survivable. A well-supplied army can endure cold. A rested army can endure mud. An army with intact transport can endure distance. The disaster came from all of these pressures arriving at once, each one making the others worse, in a system that had never been designed with enough slack to absorb even one of them, let alone all of them together. This is the escalating structure that defines the entire campaign, and it is worth walking through it plainly because it is the actual answer to the question in this documentary's title. The rail gauge difference meant supplies could not move efficiently by train until track was converted, which meant trucks had to cover distances they were never built to sustain at scale. The truck fleet's chaotic mix of 2,000 vehicle types meant breakdowns could not be repaired quickly, which meant fewer working vehicles were available precisely when the advancing army needed more of them, not fewer. The reliance on horses, itself a symptom of Germany's limited automotive industrial base, meant a huge share of the army's actual carrying capacity depended on animals that ate enormous quantities of fodder, could not be resupplied by rail as easily as fuel, and died in large numbers once winter arrived. The decision to divert armored forces toward Kiev, whatever its tactical logic, consumed weeks that the original 10-week plan had never allotted for delay, pushing the final assault on Moscow directly into the autumn mud season. The mud season, itself entirely predictable, was made catastrophic not by its existence, but by its timing, arriving exactly when the campaign's compressed schedule left no room to simply wait it out. And the absence of adequate winter equipment, a decision rooted in the refusal to admit the campaign might extend past autumn, meant that when the cold arrived on top of everything else, it struck an army already weakened by every problem that came before it. None of these individual failures, examined alone, fully explains the collapse outside Moscow. Together, compounding and amplifying each other across 6 months, they do. This is what makes Barbarossa's logistics failure such a compelling case study, rather than a simple story of German arrogance meeting Russian weather. The arrogance, if we want to call it that, was really a series of individually defensible decisions, made by people trying to solve an almost impossible equation under enormous political pressure. Hitler wanted a quick, decisive war for reasons that were as much political as military. He believed, not without some reason given recent history, that Western democracies and even Stalin's own regime might not withstand a truly rapid, overwhelming defeat. His generals, for their part, believed their operational doctrine, honed through repeated recent successes, could deliver exactly the kind of quick victory that would make the logistics problem moot before it ever became decisive. Both of these beliefs were reasonable extrapolations from very recent experience. Neither belief survived contact with the actual scale of the Soviet Union, a country roughly the size of Western Europe, stretched several times over, with weather, terrain, and distances that had defeated large invading armies before, for reasons that long predated the Wehrmacht. It is worth pausing here to address something historians still argue about, because the honest answer involves genuine uncertainty rather than a clean verdict. Could better logistics planning have saved Operation Barbarossa? Some historians argue that no realistic level of logistical preparation could have overcome the sheer scale of the distances involved, given Germany's actual industrial capacity in 1941. The Wehrmacht lacked the amount of fuel, let alone trucks and trains, to maintain their offensive in the East in 1941. And to make matters worse, it never fully fixed the problem throughout every subsequent year of fighting on that front. That second detail matters enormously. This was not a problem Germany solved once winter passed, and simply avoided repeating. Even the following year's offensive toward the Caucasus oil fields ran into strikingly similar supply breakdowns, suggesting the constraint was structural rather than accidental. Other historians point out that certain choices genuinely were avoidable, independent of Germany's overall industrial limitations. The decision to delay large-scale winter clothing production, for instance, was not an unavoidable consequence of limited factories. It was a choice rooted in optimism about the campaign's length. The judgment that replacing rail with road transport would have required at least 10 times the vehicles Germany actually possessed suggests the fundamental transportation gap was simply too large to close through better organization alone, regardless of how efficiently existing resources were managed. In other words, better staff work might have delayed the crisis, softened its edges, or spread its impact more evenly across the front. It almost certainly could not have eliminated it, because the underlying mismatch between German industrial capacity and Soviet geography was too large for any organizational fix to bridge. This is an important distinction, and it is one many popular retellings blur. Bad logistics did not sink Barbarossa the way an iceberg sinks a ship. through a single dramatic collision. It sank it the way a slow leak sinks a boat, through the steady accumulation of small, individually survivable failures that no one ever fully patched. There is a further irony worth sitting with here, because irony, done honestly rather than manufactured for effect, is one of the most useful tools for understanding why intelligent people made decisions that look baffling in hindsight. The very German military reputation for tactical brilliance and operational sophistication, the reputation that made Barbarossa's planners so confident, was built almost entirely on campaigns fought in the one region of Europe where German logistics limitations mattered least. Thaman, and especially France, offered short distances, dense paved road networks, and standard gauge railways that German trains could use immediately upon capture. The formula worked spectacularly there precisely because the logistics questions we have spent this documentary examining barely arose. Transplant that same formula onto a country roughly the geographic size of the continental United States, with a different rail gauge, sparse paved roads, and a climate capable of turning dirt into either an impassable swamp or a frozen obstacle course within a matter of weeks, and the formula's hidden dependency on short distances became catastrophically exposed. Germany's greatest strategic asset, its reputation for speed, had been built on a geographic accident of where its earlier wars happened to be fought. Nobody, including the generals themselves, seems to have fully separated the doctrine's real strengths from the specific terrain that had made those strengths decisive. That is not a criticism unique to German planners. It is an extremely common trap in military history more broadly, the tendency to mistake a method that worked under specific conditions for a method that will work anywhere. There is a final piece of this puzzle worth including, because it connects the failure outside Moscow to the broader arc of the war, rather than leaving it as an isolated winter disaster. The manpower and equipment losses suffered during the retreat from Moscow, and the strain placed on German industry trying to replace them, meant Germany entered 1942 already carrying a logistics deficit it had never actually solved, only temporarily outrun. The Nazis hoped these transportation limitations would restrict the Red Army as it later drove west after Stalingrad, but the Soviet military instead gained access to the industrial power of the United States through Lend-Lease, receiving huge numbers of locomotives and trucks. This detail deserves emphasis because it closes the loop on everything discussed so far. The exact transportation problem that had crippled the German advance in 1941, insufficient trucks, insufficient rail capacity, was solved for the Soviet Union, not by Soviet industry alone, but by American manufacturing capacity, pouring vehicles into a country that desperately needed them. Soviet forces were not especially impressed with American tanks, but American trucks were a very different matter. The very asset Germany had never been able to build at scale, a large, standardized, mass-produced truck fleet, eventually flowed to its opponent instead, tipping a logistics balance that had already been fragile from the campaign's opening weeks. In 5 stunning offensives during 1944, the Red Army destroyed the Wehrmacht, achieving exactly what the Wehrmacht had attempted and failed to achieve with Barbarossa, and advanced to the very borders of the German Reich. Lo, as Alien Asslist is later like the Edgens or leaders, and then when the Semaid went to the crush that could insips them, Niladadia, and it's even his and proximate accounts, now tell the Raznafim. Pludge. That closing symmetry is not a coincidence, worth glossing over. The tool Germany lacked in 1941, sufficient standardized motor transport to sustain a rapid advance across enormous distances, became, 3 years later, the tool that helped defeat it. So what should we actually conclude, looking back at every layer of the story, about why German logistics for Barbarossa were doomed from the start? The honest answer resists the single clean sentence that makes for a good headline, but a poor explanation. It was not simply that Germany underestimated the Soviet Union, though it did. It was not simply that winter arrived, though it did, at the worst possible moment. It was not simply that Hitler diverted forces to Kiev, though that decision cost precious weeks the plan could not spare. And it was that Germany's entire military logistics system, built around a truck fleet cobbled together from 2,000 incompatible vehicle types, a horse-drawn transport network inherited from a less industrialized war, and a railway system separated from its target by an inconvenient difference in track gauge, was never actually capable of sustaining a war of this scale, over this distance, for longer than a matter of weeks. Every major decision that followed, the push toward Smolensk, the diversion south, the drive on Moscow, the fatal shortage of winter clothing, was made by people trying to win the war fast enough that this enduring limitation would never have to be confronted directly. For a while, remarkably, it almost worked. The early encirclements were real victories. The Kiev pocket was one of the largest in military history. The initial drive toward Moscow came within sight of the city's outer defenses. But every one of those victories consumed the one resource the plan had never truly accounted for: time. And every week spent achieving them brought the campaign closer to the season in which its transportation system would finally be asked to do something it was never designed to do. The tragedy, if that is even the right word for a catastrophe that cost so many lives on both sides, is that the men who planned this invasion were not fools, and the men who fought it were not cowards or amateurs. They were operating inside a system whose fundamental limitations had been identified, discussed, and then set aside, not out of ignorance, but out of the belief that speed would make those limitations irrelevant before they had time to matter. Speed did not arrive fast enough, and that served. And when it failed to arrive, every problem that had been quietly deferred since the planning stage in Berlin, the mismatched trucks, the wrong-gauge railways, the underfed horses, the missing winter coats, all came due at once, in the mud, and then the ice, outside a city that German soldiers could, by December, see through their field glasses, but never actually reach. That is the real story behind the failure of German logistics in Operation Barbarossa. Not a single mistake, and not simply the weather, but a system of interlocking assumptions, each one reasonable in isolation, that combined to produce an outcome none of them individually could have caused. If that kind of layered explanation, the kind that replaces a simple villain with a genuine system of interacting failures, is the sort of history you find worth your time, this channel is built around finding exactly those hidden mechanisms behind the most familiar stories of the war.